Our next speaker is Professor Tamar Dayan from the School of Zoology, and she's also the head of our new museum. And Tamar is going to talk about GMOs and the ecological perspective.
There's no place to move on stage anyway. Hi, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And actually, I have to make a qualifying comment that I'm not a botanist, not a plant geneticist. I'm a zoologist, an ecologist, a conservation biologist, and for the last, I think 17 or 18 years, every 2 or 3 years, I do a public service for everyone. There's nobody who studies the effects, the ecological effects of genetically modified organisms in Israel. So I read all the latest literature and get updated and share what I've learned with everyone else. So I'm not going to show any results of research from my lab. My lab doesn't deal with genetically modified organisms or their effects. Is this doing something? Is this doing something? Haba? There's got to be a better way to do this than what I'm doing now. I wanted, as a backdrop, we have to know that about a quarter of Earth's terrestrial system are already agriculturally influenced, if not agricultural systems. And the implication is that we've transformed a whole lot of Earth. So I'm sure that I speak for all ecologists and conservation biologists that the ultimate goal to get as much food security or as much quality food for humankind while affecting the environment in the least is shared by everyone. And so far, so good. The question, of course, always is how to go about it. What are the safest ways, the socially most acceptable ways, the economically most acceptable ways, and the ecologically most acceptable ways. And I should add to this that this should be of interest. Oh my God, what am I doing? Should be of interest. אני יכולה לקחת, אבל אני לא יודעת איך להזיז את השקף הבא. תגידי לי מה אני עושה פה. Okay. And it's certainly a concern in a country like Israel, which is very small. Already over half the Mediterranean zone of Israel is agricultural, and that's straight agriculture. It doesn't count cattle grazing, because if we put in cattle grazing, I don't think there's any place in the Mediterranean zone of Israel that you won't find a cow pie now. It's all overgrazed. So it's all highly agricultural. I've been reading the literature in the last few nights because I didn't have time during the days, and I can share that first, the biotechnology is becoming increasingly sophisticated. So I'm not trying to judge the effectiveness of the tools. I trust that everyone, including the last speaker, understands what they're doing and knows the best of the best in biotechnology. The interesting part on my angle of things is that in the last 15 or 17 years, there has been a huge focus of ecological and environmental research on food production systems, which is increasing today. And this is because of what I mentioned yesterday, because of the huge toll on Earth. Great areas are turning into agriculture, and the cost in the environment is significant, and the search for the correct food systems is a very big thing in ecology today. But there are alternative approaches, and some of the alternative approaches clash in understanding and in perspective with genetically modified agriculture. A third point to make is that the literature is becoming increasingly complex, not because of the science necessarily, but because it's politically and socially and economically motivated. And very frequently, it's really hard to get real data out of the literature. For example, how much more food do we get out of genetically modified crops that are already being grown? Or how much harm is there? And it's I went to read reviews, I went to read original literature. It's often very political and very difficult to tell. So agroecosystems are complex. They interact with natural ecosystems, which is where I come in, and they occur within a complex socioeconomic and cultural environment. I went back to the basics. In 2000, there was a publication in Science that dealt with, and it was early on, that dealt with the potential advantages of genetically modified agriculture. And I put in E.O. Wilson's picture here because he is the guru of biodiversity, and he was all for it, at least at the time, because of the third reason, because of increased yield means less land transformed into agriculture, while more food for people and more opportunities for nature. So those were the upsides, the potential advantages. But there were risks that were mentioned, risks of invasiveness, effects of non-target species, such as beneficial species, local, native, endemic species, development of resistance or weediness, and indirect and unexpected effects. And basically, this is what is still being studied 18 years later. It's getting more sophisticated. The questions are becoming more focused. There's more experimental work. There's more field work, not enough field work. There's work dealing with pollination. There's gene flow, horizontal gene flow, effect of Bt crops and beneficial insects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, in general, the work is not enough. The systems are incredibly complex. Usually there's very little understood at the landscape level still, and there's very little long-term research. So there's still a lot that we don't know, and a lot of stuff is out still being studied. There are effects. How serious are these effects in comparison with the benefits? Really difficult to tell, in part because the benefits are still pretty fuzzy in many places. And I have to say, these things about saving third world countries are, I've been hearing, we've had these sessions for about 17 years, but basically most of the genetically modified agriculture, that's not where it is. It's herbicide tolerance and Bt crops, and if we look at the left-hand side, you can see the trend. Most of the genetically modified crops are either herbicide tolerance or what's called Roundup Ready in different varieties, or Bt to be resistant to insects. One of the interesting things that I found when I was searching the web last night was to see this figure with the increase in glyphosate. This is a USGS figure, increase in glyphosate use in the United States, which means, and it's always been claimed, and now apparently it's true, that with genetic modification there is also an increase in this use of something that was considered once very, very friendly and now is being banned increasingly in the world. Risk of invasiveness. I have to say, to start with, there's a huge surge of study of invasion biology in the world now. It costs taxpayers a lot of money. This is not genetically modified invasions. I want to make this perfectly clear. It's just something that worries us, because if we have something that's a superweed and it will invade, it can become a big problem. It's an ecological problem, it's an economic problem, and it's happening apparently more than thought. Not a lot, but it is happening. This is, for example, canola. GM crop escapes into American wild in nature a few years ago. The explanations from Monsanto. Clearly it happens along roads. Clearly it happens in old fields. Clearly, from what I understand from reading the literature, there is some spread. How much will it spread? How much will it affect the ecology of other species? Still to be found out. The other worry, of course, or the greater worry, is that many crop plants, most crop plants, breed with relatives, wild relatives, and the fear is that the traits that allow them to be superweeds, such as herbicide tolerance or insect immunity or tolerance, will spread to other species and they will become weeds. So that's one thing that ecologists are concerned about. The other thing that ecologists are studying and are concerned about is direct non-target effects on beneficial native organisms. There's been a big thing about monarch butterflies, and apparently it was not justified. Also about bees, and apparently that was not justified. But there is a lot of research now on lepidopterans and other species and how they are affected in the field by transgenic crops. And what does that mean in terms of pollination? What does that mean in terms of pest control, and so on. There's a study to look at the distances that there should be between genetically modified crops and natural ecosystems without harming the species in natural ecosystems. But it does go against another trend in agriculture now, and that is because there's a reduction in habitat diversity, a reduction in plant diversity, there is a reduction in weeds, there is a reduction in other plants, and in plant diversity, in seed bank diversity. As a result, a reduction in the diversity of insects. We know many insects are beneficial. It's a big decision to have areas that are devoid of life except for the crop, and many ecologists would argue that probably this is not a good way to go. Indirect effects can be various, just to say a couple, because species can be more resistant, in this case, for example, to insects. This can give them a competitive edge on other species, so you can have community-level effects. And this has mainly been studied, as far as I could see, in the lab or in controlled conditions. Resistance, because you're using, in case of herbicide tolerance, for example, you're using a single herbicide on a long term, which is not good policy, and the chances of producing resistance to the herbicide are great, and apparently, according to the literature, this is happening. Variability and unexpected results. There are pleiotropic effects, and it's clear that the more precise things happen, the less this will happen, but these things do occur, at least under experimental conditions today. Reduced tillage, because of, and canola is usually the prime suspect for a lot of things, but because canola has volunteers, and these volunteers are herbicide resistant, and different herbicide resistant strains have crossed. In some places, reduced tillage is not an option in Canada because you need to destroy the volunteers, and they stay in the seed bank for many years to come, even when you want to shift from GM crops to non-GM crops. And a really interesting study that I read a couple of years ago was also from Canadian farmers who did raise transgenic canola. So they were not against the idea. You know, it's true, you're right, a lot of people are against the idea, no question about it. But some people, some scientists question or worry about aspects of the technology, not because they are emotional about it, but because there are different reasons to be worried about it. In this case, Monsanto was putting pressure on the Canadian government to go for Roundup Ready wheat. And the farmers said, we won't be able to deal with the weediness, we won't be able to deal with the genes that will transfer to other species, we won't be able to separate it from non-GM wheats. We don't want to do it, and why the hell is everyone putting pressure on us to do it? And it's a good question, because children in Canada are not dying of eye disease. So there are many, many different reasons to go this way, and surely some of them are really fantastic, and then perhaps others are largely economic, and perhaps sometimes they're not necessarily for the good of the environment or ecology, and perhaps not even for the good of the economy of the specific country, such as in this case these farmers. Clearly from the literature, it's pretty clear that the distance, long-term dispersal was underestimated, and as a result, gene flow was underestimated in various cases, both in experimental conditions and in modeling. It's easy to model diffusion dispersal. It's difficult to model long-range dispersal, but long-range or jump dispersal does occur, and you need to factor it because it's not something that doesn't happen in nature. In the literature, I've looked tonight, and I won't give you the whole list of genes that appeared in the wrong places in countries that weren't supposed to raise these strains at all. But one of the most saddest ones, of course, is Mexico, where there's a lot, part of their natural capital is the native races of maize, and these have shown several years ago already genetically modified hybridization. It's a long time ago, but I liked this report from the National Academy of Sciences in the United States because I think it's a very important report and something for us to remember. Human error, such as a failure to perform appropriate scouting for volunteers, inadvertent mixing, etc., and inadequate cleaning of equipment and violations of procedures. People make errors, and these are errors that are easy to make because you can't eyeball the difference between the different seeds. And there are very interesting examples of these mistakes made in the scientific literature. So my final sentence is a citation from this paper that says that unlike most of the agricultural technologies introduced in the past, the decision to introduce transgenic crops on a broad scale may be irreversible. And I would add, so you really want to check the ecological and environmental impacts of this action. Thank you.